With the country's growth projections remaining, as you heard from Azza Jamin, well below 2%. We all know it's a juggling game. How will COVID-19 be treated going forward? How will we respond to the financial assistance committed at COP26 towards a just energy transition? Xolelwa Kashe is a director at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, Mistra, whose flagship project is the Ndlulamithis SA Scenarios project. She joins us now via Zoom to look at some of these scenarios. A very good morning and thanks for making the time to speak to us.
Good morning, Desiree, and thank you for having me, and good morning to your viewers at home.
So your work involves using events and research to create future scenarios. We'll look at a few events in the country, but let's start here. 2 days ago, that report into the July unrest was released, and it paints a grim picture of government's uncoordinated response to both the cause of the events and the unfolding of the events at that time. How can President Cyril Ramaphosa use this report to reassure South Africans?
I think in terms of the recent uprisings, well, what has now been referred to as the July uprising, it would be important to also look at them within the historical context, because we tend to isolate this event as if it's not part of a broader challenge that South Africa is facing. We do know that we have an issue of violent protest. We do know that we do have a culture of violence. I mean, your previous contributors were speaking to gender-based violence. There's also, those xenophobic attacks. So I think we need to broaden the conversation so that we can understand the root cause of why South Africans respond the way they do to challenges. Because it seems like as a country, we are always on a brink of rupture. And with a society such as ours, that's always on that brink of a rupture, it's very easy for any opportunist to take advantage of that situation wherein anyone can come in and trigger, violent uprisings. So it will be necessary to look at the history. Where does it come from? Because if you track the history of protest in South Africa, which is incidentally something that we are also starting to look at Mistra, to not just focus on July per se, but also to look at how protest has evolved in South Africa, the causes and so on. But I think what makes this July uprising stand out is that it involved, the arrest of a former president, President Zuma. So I think that's what makes it interesting, but we should not lose sight of the broader environment when it comes to how we protest and how we address our grievances with the state.
So let's move now to that commitment by COP26 to financially assist South Africa's just energy transition. Will this get a mention in the SONA? And what is your research saying about South Africa's energy and climate work? Well,
the conversation around climate change has still not matured in South Africa. It's still regarded as perhaps an elitist conversation. It's not nearly as inclusive enough. But also the language that is used when it comes to research or understanding, climate change and our just transition it tends to be very technical, and it then excludes others. And one of the things that we've found is that it would be very important to not just to be a follower country, because there are those imperatives or targets that are set at a global level, and countries in Africa tend to follow without engaging with their own local realities. For example, South Africa is one of the biggest producers of coal, and we've got whole towns that are reliant on the coal mining industry. So if we were to transition, consideration has to be made for the job losses that will come with that, but also in terms of what happens to those municipalities. I mean, a case in point would be municipalities in Mpumalanga, such as eMalahleni, because there would be a whole economy that would have to be eroded. So South Africa also has to look at its own creative ways of finding means to replace or to ensure that there's no job losses that come as a result of this. I mean, others are also speaking to the idea of clean coal, which is really disputed, especially at the global level. But I think what is very important here is this over-reliance on global targets and following without considering our own realities.
Of course, just staying with climate, that announcement by the presidency a few days ago of the appointment of former South African Reserve Bank Deputy Governor and former CEO of ABSA, Daniel Minele, as the head of the Presidential Climate Commission. Will this strengthen South Africa's place in the world in terms of efforts to respond to climate?
Now, like many other challenges that we're facing, we've already spoken at length to the lack of capacity within the state. So there has to be an admission and an understanding that it will not be possible for the state alone to engage with these challenges. There's the private sector, which is, very, very entangled with this, our contribution towards, the carbon footprint. There's the mining industry. What can they bring to the table? Because if you're going to rely on the state alone, then we do have a challenge, because we do know that, first of all, there's corruption, which everyone speaks to. There's also this lack of capacity to plan. And if you're dealing with an issue such as climate change, you need to have the capability for doing long-term planning. So that's where social compacting would probably be most relevant, wherein you can, forge partnerships between a government, the private sector, labor, but also civil society. At the moment, all these social partners are working in isolation in terms of engaging with the transition of the country. You find that the private sector also is folding their arms at times, waiting for policy certainty. But I don't think that's going to come anytime soon. So there has to be, courageous leadership that can galvanize all these social partners to engage with this issue. Perhaps it can be a priority, because that's another thing. We've got too many priorities. If we were to say in the next period, then this is a priority, then everything will fall in. How do we then protect jobs that exist that might be lost through the transition? How do we create new jobs? How do we build new industries? Can we promote research for alternative forms of energy generation? And I think there's a lot of potential in South Africa, because we do have an endowment with many other mineral resources that can potentially contribute to the transition.
You speak about social compacts. One consistent thread in President Cyril Ramaphosa's SONAs is social compacting. Do we fully understand this call by the president, and how should we be engaging, we as South Africans be engaging with this call?
I don't think there is a clear understanding of what social compacting is. And yes, the president has, made various calls for compacting, but I think it needs to be communicated effectively to society at large. And maybe the language that is used, we need to pay attention to the language that we use, because as long as we don't understand what social compacting is, because we find that even in government, there are many people who don't understand what compacting is. But compacting is really essentially, as explained, agreements among social partners. So everyone has to have a place at the table. So that is labor, that is civil societies, representing communities, business, and government. But there are principles to social compacting, and also there's key ingredients to it. And I feel that we do have those ingredients, because social compacting is usually relevant for fragile societies, and we do know that our society is one of those. We also need to pay attention to the historical context, and knowing where we come from as a country. And now it's almost 30 years since the transition. We still have not moved in terms of understanding the wounds of the past and the impacts that, would have led to, for example, the inequality that we have at the moment. So those things, we need to pay attention to those, but also at the same time, coming into a compacting platform with an understanding that there has to be this principle of compromise, wherein, each of the social partners is willing to give, while at the same time taking. So sometimes you'd find that on platforms such as the NEDLAC, where compacting is supposed to happen by law, as governed by the NEDLAC Act, there's still no such principle. We find that the social partners tend to hold on to very strong ideological positions, and you find no way forward. But in effective compacting, one has to understand that you don't have to hold on to your ideological position, but we have to come in with the spirit of understanding that you have to, let go or forgo some of your, fundamental principles for the good of, the nation. So I think first and foremost, the president needs to debunk, this notion of compacting, and not just mention it without ensuring that it is understood, because it is a national effort that requires all of us to fall in so that we can forge this agreement, because it is a kind of a contract that we all have to, contribute to, and we all have to ensure that, we live by. But there also has to be sanctioning mechanisms for those who then do not live up to what was expected of them as per the social compact.
Let's thank you again for speaking to us today.